The name Boris Johnson has chosen for Britain's strategy to defeat COVID-19, whack-a-mole, suggests a government with a reactive approach acting only after problems have reared their ugly heads and ultimately ending in chaos. It's not a reassuring phrase, but for once, our Prime Minister might have said something which is actually quite close to the truth. And we'll be talking tonight about the events leading up to the Leicester lockdown. They encapsulate so many of the weaknesses of this Tory government's approach to COVID-19. Some really shocking stuff, actually, that we're going to be talking about on this show. And to do so, as ever, on a Wednesday, I'm joined by Dalia Gebrial. How are you doing, Dalia?
Hello, hello, hello. I'm doing all right. How are you?
Yeah, very well. As you'll know, it's the second show we've done from back in the studio. I feel like my head is more the right size now, so I'm feeling a bit more
nice
confident
bookcase
and
that is
comfortable
behind
in my
you
skin.
that I'm sure will be very scrutinized on Twitter in the coming few days.
We've got loads of stories for you tonight as well. Actually, we're going to talk about Jeremy Hunt's hypocrisy, Boris Johnson's New Deal, a power grab from Keir Starmer, another one, and forward momentum sweeping the board in elections to run the most important institution on the Labour left. As ever, you can let us know your thoughts on the hashtag TiskySour. You can tweet on that and share the show link because we want to get more people watching this live. On to our first story. We've heard of flattening the curve and staying alert to save lives, but the government has found a new disconcerting phrase to describe their coronavirus strategy. This is Boris Johnson speaking on Monday.
We have to remain vigilant. We have to continue to do the basics, washing our hands and all that. Plus, we need to have local lockdowns and local whack-a-mole strategies where that's necessary.
And that phrase came up again in today's PMQs.
We did in Leicester exactly what we did, for instance, Mr. Speaker, in Kirklees or in Bradford or in Weston-super-Mare or other places where very effective whack-a-mole strategies have been put in place.
So what is a whack-a-mole strategy? So it essentially means implementing local lockdowns as and when COVID-19 rears its head. The phrase is an odd one, though. It shouldn't really apply to pandemic control. So whack-a-mole, obviously you can't predict where the mole is going to come up. And you respond to it in an incredibly reactive way. When you see its head, you sort of whack it. It's very difficult to strategically plan how you're going to win a game of whack-a-mole. That shouldn't be the case with a pandemic. And that's obviously because by studying the dynamics of the disease, we can predict where coronavirus outbreaks are going to happen by having a proper surveillance system. We should also be able to work out where an outbreak happens before it's too late. If it's obvious where the outbreak is, there's been some sort of government failure. And yes, it does seem like there has been some government failure in this case. Leicester, the first region in Britain to go into a lockdown, provides an example of this. There was a failure to use decent surveillance to catch outbreaks early, and also a failure to see the warning signs as to why it was quite likely that an outbreak of COVID-19 would happen there. On that surveillance question, this has been a political controversy today for very good reason. That's because it's been revealed that local authorities in Leicester were only made aware of a very small minority of the positive cases being found in their city. They're informed of people who tested positive in hospitals, but not people who tested positive for coronavirus in commercial labs, either in drive-ins or via the postal service. That's called Pillar 2. Tests in hospital are called Pillar 1. Tests done in commercial labs are called Pillar 2. And we're going to get up a graphic from the FT, hopefully, which shows you how significant this was, what an error this was from the government, and why Leicester were ultimately going blind in this ability to track and respond correctly to the virus. Maybe we can't get that up right now, but yep, we do. Brilliant. Okay, so the blue lines there you can see the dates at the bottom. The blue lines there are people who've been tested positive in Pillar 1, so who've tested positive in hospitals. And the red lines, that's Pillar 2, people who have tested positive in commercial labs. Now, the problem was Leicester Council and the public health authorities there were only told about the red lines last Thursday. And you can see that there was a huge outbreak by June the 19th, or earlier than June the 19th, which they were completely unaware of. So to put figures on this, between the 13th and 26th of June, local authorities in Leicester were aware of 80 people who had tested positive. In fact, in that period, 944 people had tested positive for coronavirus. The government had access to all of this data, but only told local authorities last Thursday, obviously way after those cases were apparent. And unsurprisingly, local government figures in Leicester believe the delay may have had severe costs. So from that FT piece where we got that graphic, I would wish that they had shared that data with us right from the start, said Peter, Leicester's mayor. And I wish they had taken a more speedy decision rather than leaving it 11 days. That's a long gap and a long time for the virus to spread. So obviously they're pissed off. They were running blind. If they'd known there was this outbreak earlier, they could have responded earlier. But once again, just like with the lockdown, the government reacts too late. And in many policy areas, it's obviously preferable to not act late. But when it comes to pandemic control, acting late is literally the worst thing you can do. Whether or not your policy proposals are perfect, just doing them early makes so much difference. And once again, we've seen that the government is not learning anything. Dalia, what do you make of this? Are you reassured by the whack-a-mole slogan? It is catchy. It just doesn't make me feel particularly safe.
Yeah, I mean, for someone who, whatever you believe, whatever you think about his policy platforms, and obviously I have major issues with them, but for someone who's already always been quite effective at kind of storytelling, this is a really weird way to brand your policy in quite an honest way, actually, which is just sort of unbridled chaos. But this very much seems to be a kind of continuation of the strategy that already got us in this issue, which is that locking down after there appears to be a problem, i.e. lots of people get sick and experience symptoms, because of how sort of heavily contagious this virus is, because of how long it can live on surfaces, the fact that there's this massive lag between people getting infected and getting symptoms, and the fact that so many people don't get any symptoms, means that waiting until people get symptoms or the problem becomes visible is basically putting the cart before the horse. And so, we need to be very strategic and preventative rather than reactive, because it seems that once this virus sort of gets its claws into a particular community, it spreads like wildfire. And we're going to discuss this later, but I think what is so interesting about this virus as well is that it's not random. It's actually quite systematic in the conditions through which it spreads. And, we're going to talk about this more when it comes to the garment factory in Leicester and how related it is to particular conditions. So there is really no reason why we couldn't adopt that preventative strategy. The data and the evidence is there, and the longer we leave it, the more time and lives it's going to cost us later down the line. But fundamentally, this is down to two things, I think. I think firstly, it's an attempt to minimize the number of lockdowns that have to happen in order to sort of sustain a growth-driven economy at the same time of trying to stop the virus claiming lives. But the problem is that the way that this virus operates means that lockdowns have to happen preventatively. So you can't sort of be economical in what kinds of lockdowns that you implement. But when it comes to the data as well, I think this is, again, a recurring theme that I've been seeing, which is that decades of starving the state of its resources in every arena except for its most punitive forces through austerity has basically created a condition where the state is not able to deliver rapid, coordinated responses. And that's where we're seeing this sort of like ridiculous lag between the data being gathered and it being distributed amongst different local authorities. That's because we've trimmed so much fat off the infrastructure of the state, particularly when it comes to care provision and healthcare, that when it comes to sort of needing that extra slack in the system and needing that kind of efficiency, it's simply not there.
And I mean, I think you're totally right to point to the fact that this is, again, about state weakness, something we talk about so much on Tisky Sour, because it's not a coincidence that it was the testing that was done in the hospital, which local authorities are informed about, but it's testing done in private labs, often run by people like Deloitte, which is not getting to the people who need it. The government have claimed this is because of data protection. So they're saying the fact that local authorities aren't getting as much information they need is because we've got to protect people's privacy. But Labour's Shadow Health Minister, Justin Madders, has a different theory. I find it quite persuasive. Let's get up a tweet he sent today. So he says, the idea that data protection is stopping testing information going to councils is for the birds. This is the real reason. They didn't put it in the contracts in the first place. And attached to that tweet, he sort of puts as evidence a question which was put by Stella Creasy, the Labour MP, to Nadine Dorries, a health minister. So Creasy asked whether the contract with Deloitte included, so Deloitte is the consultancy firm, they don't normally act in testing, whether they had in their contract an obligation to hand over the data to local authorities. This was Dorries's response. We can get that back up. As an existing professional services provider to the public sector, Deloitte's expertise is being used to supplement in-house resource to deliver significant programs of work, which currently include the national response to COVID-19. The contract with Deloitte does not require the company to report positive cases to Public Health England and local authorities. So that's Nadine Dorries's answer there. So the government trying to say, oh, this is data protection. This is just obviously, an unavoidable problem of governance that some institutions and organizations want information, but we've got to protect people's privacy. It turns out, it seems, they just forgot to put it in the contract, right? I mean, it's quite possible that the lawyers at Deloitte are better than the lawyers at the government. And this is the kind of outcome you get. As Dalia indicated before, though, it is not just this failure to get information to the people that it needs to get to prevent huge outbreaks that has been shown up in Leicester, but also how different societal conditions and contexts allow for big outbreaks of COVID-19 to occur. Now, across the world, we've seen that one of the places where you are most likely to get a sort of super spreader event is in factories, especially meat packing factories, actually. That's because partly, well, there's so many people who work in there, it's quite noisy, so people are shouting all the time, which means you're more likely to expel particles, and because it's cold. We have had certain outbreaks from meat packing factories in the UK, but in Leicester, it seems that it's garment factories and the garment industry that could have been one of the sources of this outbreak. So there was a new report which was out today. I really recommend reading it, into how garment factories operated in Leicester right through the lockdown. So even at the height of the lockdown, they were operating at full capacity, never shut down. The reason was, well, I suppose because they had profit maximizing bosses, but also the online retail giant Boohoo actually, it seems, increased their sales during the lockdown. I suppose because people couldn't go to shops anymore, so they were going online to buy things, and presumably they did a big advertising campaign at that period of time. And so these factories are running at full capacity, people being forced to go into work. And it also gets worse. I'm just going to get up a quote from the Guardian copy of this report. So they say one unnamed worker quoted in the report said he had told his employer he was unwell, but was told to come in to work anyway, even after testing positive for COVID-19. So you have bosses telling people to come into work even though they've tested positive. He was told not to tell any other workers about the result, the report said. In one factory with 80 staff, around 15 had COVID-19 at the same time, another worker told the authors. So workers in a number of factories told the group that there had been no physical distancing measures in place and that their employers had closed only for a few days at all. So you've got people in the height of the lockdown. And again, we talked about this a lot on Tisky Sour, this idea that what the government had said was that, don't go to work unless you need to. And there was no obligation whatsoever really on employers to allow people to stay at home. They made it completely at the whim of employers. And when you have incredibly irresponsible employers like you do in these garment factories, this is the kind of result you get. Obviously, it's terrible for the people working in the factory, also terrible for the whole community, because you've created basically, well, it's a garment factory, but it's now also a coronavirus factory. The report also included things like furlough fraud. So you've got companies who are claiming furlough money whilst forcing their workers to go into work. So not only are they putting people in danger, they're making a pocket out of this. Earlier today, though, I spoke to one of the authors of the report, who was, we were lucky enough to have a conversation with earlier, Meg Lewis. I started by asking if she'd be confident connecting the continued operation of Leicester's garment factories during the lockdown to the outbreak, which we are now currently all so aware of?
Well, I think, we're not from a medical background. Based on the information that the public have been given around the spread of coronavirus, and also the measures put in place. So the fact that we are meant to be socially distancing and having adequate sanitation, we can see how much disruption it's caused to many different forms of production and service provision. So I think that for these small factories to continue operating at 100%, without the social distancing, without adequate PPE, I would assume that would definitely be a contributing factor, at least.
And whose fault is this? So you've got people who are testing positive for COVID-19 and being forced to go into work. I mean, is that illegal? Is the problem that the laws are too lax, or that the laws aren't properly being enforced? And I know that also in your report you sort of highlighted the role of Boohoo, which is a big online clothing company. Is it the buyers that should be, take responsibility for this? Is it the bosses? Is it the government? Where do you place the blame for what's happened here?
I think to go after individual factories or specific factories would definitely be to miss the point of the wider systemic issues that we're seeing at the moment. So in supply chains, whether that's global supply chains or local supply chains that we're seeing in Leicester, there's a huge imbalance of power. So the buyers and the big brands have a lot of power in the supply chains, and it's, they're dictating the price of goods, the deadlines, the turnarounds. So these purchasing practices are linked completely with the conditions that clothes are made in. So I think it's really important that we look at the wider issues. So instead of just looking at factories and who's really got the power in those positions, and I think then we'll be looking at the big brands.
So yeah, I mean, it's a familiar story. It's one that could have been predicted. The fact that the government left it in employers' power, whether or not that they should call people into work or not, meant that those employers who could see that they could make a buck from coronavirus, because potentially, in this case, more people are shopping online, maybe some of their competitors had shut down, they go into overdrive. They're working at 100%. They're getting people to come into work even if they've got coronavirus. And again, it tells a broader story about how neoliberalism has damaged their health. If these people were in trade unions, do you think this would have happened? If you had powerful trade unions in this country who could negotiate with bosses, do we really think that in the middle of a global pandemic, people would be forced to go into work after they tested positive from coronavirus? No. Dalia.
Yeah, I mean, this is the manifestation of decades of, as you mentioned, degradation of workers' rights. And these particular sectors where we see very strong outbreaks of coronavirus, so factory-based work, social care, taxi drivers, healthcare workers, these are all, particularly things like factory-based work and taxi drivers, these are jobs that have become more and more precarious, that have become the least protected by the state, the least protected by trade unions. They are legislated out of key workers' rights. And it's no secret that they often tend to come disproportionately from working class, black and brown communities. So this relationship between the kind of work you do, the identity that you inhabit, and the level of protection and the right to safety that you can have are once again all brought to surface as connected during this pandemic. And essentially, again, this is just an example of a willful ignorance of the data and the evidence. We know what kinds of workplaces are specific hotbeds or potential super spreader sites for the virus. Autonomy did the jobs at risk index very shortly after the outbreak of this pandemic, which identified the jobs that people are most at risk of contracting coronavirus. But the issue here is really that the deregulation that has occurred over the past 40 years has created this condition whereby we constantly see the gains and the profit privatized and the losses socialized. So when lots of people get sick because they're being forced to go to work, even though their work is not necessary, Boohoo churning out the latest sort of copy of whatever Kim Kardashian's wearing on her Instagram is not essential work. That is gaining profit for those corporations. And where in terms of the cost of that, the cost on the NHS, the strain on the community, who pays for that? It's the community. So I completely agree with Meg. This is a structural issue, and it's not specific to this one factory. And it really reminds me of Ruth Wilson Gilmore, who talks about how the way that racial capitalism works is that it leaves some people, particularly those who are at the bottom rung of work, systemically exposed to premature death or harm. And the ways in which workers are not only being denied their rights to health and safety at work, the fact that they aren't able to have a voice or hold anyone accountable. If you are forced to go into work and your employee is acting recklessly and making you come into work, even if you have symptoms, what is the process of accountability? There is none. So those things together come together to essentially make it so that not only are these particular communities very vulnerable to coronavirus, but it makes these sites into super spreading sites that have massive impacts throughout the whole community.
We're going to go on to our next segment in a moment. It's another coronavirus one. But first, we've got almost 1,400 people watching. Let's try and get as close to 2,000 as possible as we can this Wednesday evening. So please do share the show link and tweet on the hashtag TiskiSour. Jeremy Hunt was Health Secretary during the height of austerity. He oversaw the biggest sustained squeeze in the NHS budget for over half a century. He also went to war with junior doctors. But as chair of the Health and Social Care Committee, now a Conservative backbencher, not a Conservative cabinet minister, coronavirus has allowed him the opportunity to have a bit of a rebrand. He can often be found asking pertinent questions in those select committees or giving what seemed like on the surface fairly decent interviews in the mainstream press. To give him credit, he was one of the people I remember back in March who was saying it seems ridiculous that we're still allowing visitors into care homes. There was a moment where I was like, God, do I want him to be health secretary again? Obviously, it was a strange moment in my life this year. He continued this week to say decent things on television. This is him speaking on Channel 4 News on Tuesday.
Well, we are unique because we are introducing test and trace at a stage when community transmissions of the virus are still running at over 3,000 a day. So that's why it's going to be trickier to get it to work. But I do think it's the right approach. I just think we should go further.
It's going to be trickier. Is it actually impossible when transmission is running at such a high level? I mean, you were quite kind describing as unique. That's our unique problem, isn't it?
It is. And that's why I think we have to be imaginative with doing things that they haven't had to do in Taiwan and Singapore and countries like that, which is why I think we should have mass testing of NHS and care staff, for example, so that every week or every fortnight, everyone in the NHS automatically has a test. Everyone in care homes automatically has a test. Because we know that up to 20% of the people with coronavirus in hospitals actually caught it in that hospital.
I was just distracted by a comment that was telling me hopefully TiskiSour accidentally mispronounced Jeremy Hunt's name. The only way one can mispronounce it. We all sort of remember that repeatedly occurring when he was cabinet minister. I'll allow you to imagine what that mispronouncement would be. Now, that was a very good point that Jeremy Hunt there made on Channel 4 News. What he's saying is that in countries such as South Korea or Taiwan, when they've successfully suppressed the virus, you don't need to do mass testing that much because, if someone gets symptoms and gets found to be positive for coronavirus, then you'll have an app. You can contact loads of people. You only really need to get tested if you've been if you've been in contact with someone with coronavirus. That doesn't really work in a country like Britain because so many people have coronavirus that in general, in certain sectors of the economy, we should just do mass testing. It doesn't matter if you're a care home worker or a doctor. If you haven't been called by the test and trace system, you're in such a sensitive position in the social care sector, in the economy, that you should get tested all the time. And we know that so many people during this crisis have caught coronavirus in hospital or in care homes, precisely those places which should be most secure from it. He there is suggesting, let's do mass testing of people who work in hospitals and care homes. Very sensible, weekly testing. There is a problem, though. Before you buy into this narrative that Jeremy Hunt is a changed man, now he doesn't just care about his own career and effectively cutting the NHS while sort of justifying it to the public, going to war with junior doctors. He is not a changed man, okay? And the evidence for this is that what he was arguing for there, mass weekly testing, that was voted for in Parliament last week. So the Labour Party put forward an opposition day motion, which was to say, look, exactly as I've just been explaining, as Jeremy Hunt's just been explaining, if we want to get our hospitals and our social care sector back up and running effectively in a non-dangerous way, we need weekly tests. How did Jeremy Hunt vote? Let's take a look. You'd have thought this guy, he's so positive about this idea, you'd have thought he'd have voted for it. Nope, he voted with the government. So Jeremy Hunt one day on the television saying, look, we need to do weekly tests. He has an opportunity to put his money where his mouth is and vote for it. He votes against. How difficult is it to vote for something you believe? He's not even in the cabinet. It's not like he would have had to resign if he'd had voted for this obviously good motion, which he evidently agrees with. So why vote against it? Why undermine your credibility like that? Dalia, what do you make of this story?
I'm not going to claim to understand what goes through Jeremy Hunt's brain. What I do think is that, as you said, when people have vested systemic interests in particular models, for example, we know that Jeremy Hunt was absolutely desperate to sell off parts of the NHS when he was Secretary of Health. We know that he has familial and professional connections to companies that want to privatize the NHS or privatize parts of the NHS, and that doesn't change overnight. What frustrates me is that you say that the vote happened before this interview, right? So my question is, why does Cathy Newman let him get away with saying something that is totally inconsistent? He knows he has to say it because it's basically the only common sense response that can possibly fly at this point in time. But she lets him get away with basically not practicing what he preaches. And I think this is, again, a kind of ongoing issue with our journalists, where I'm not seeing them holding government to account rapidly and robustly enough at a time when this kind of doublespeak is literally costing so many lives.
I mean, and politicians just don't, it's an obvious point that sort of just comes to me. Politicians are never held to account, are they? I mean, you can literally, Tony Blair can still appear on the television as a respectable figure who can comment on foreign policy after entering the most catastrophic foreign policy event of this century. Hundreds of thousands of people died. Theresa May, yesterday, the Labour Party was sharing a clip of her sort of criticising the government. I thought, fine, exploit internal divisions within the Conservative Party. But the fact that Theresa May, I can't remember a single time since she resigned as Prime Minister that she was asked about the Windrush scandal, right? As a politician, what consequences are there for causing immense pain? One of the key reasons why our NHS was so underprepared for coronavirus, why our social care sector was so underprepared for coronavirus, is because of a decade of squeezed budgets, which were implemented by this man, Jeremy Hunt. And now he is, and as I'll admit, he asked some decent questions. But really, could we not find someone to ask decent questions who wasn't responsible for precisely the catastrophe that we're in? I mean, it's infuriating.
It is incredibly infuriating. And I think it comes down to the fact that behind the scenes, a lot of these primetime journalists and a lot of politicians are mates. There's this sense that in order to gain access, in order to gain exclusives, in order to be the journalist who can nab the leak or have, information leaked to them, that you have to become sort of friendly and go to the same cocktail parties and do the same kind of come from the same background and have gone to the same schools. And that creates inevitably forms of kinship and forms of and lack of accountability and a very unhealthy media culture. And when you talk about, you know, the fact that we're in this problem because of 10 years of austerity, let's not forget that the economic fallacy that the national economy is run like a personal household budget, that, you know, Labour overspent, and that's what caused the economic recession, which was a global economic recession. So how Gordon Brown was responsible for that, I think that's vastly overestimating the level of influence Gordon Brown has had over anything. That, you know, that Labour caused the recession by overspending. And so now we all need to tighten our belts, which means that nurses have to have a pay freeze for the next 10 years. That was an economic fallacy. That was something that was demonstrably untrue. And any economist worth their salt can tell you that. But the government was allowed to have that narrative run throughout every major newspaper and taken for granted as making sense, even though it could be verified as not true. And I think it comes down to this very cushy relationship that exists between people who are powerful in the media and people who are powerful politically. It creates an unhealthy media culture, and it creates an unhealthy political culture as well.
Now, at this point in the shows, I normally ask you to subscribe to our YouTube channel, and that, you know, that request still applies. But I have to tell you, it's now not good enough. This is not of our choosing, but apparently we've been told by many of our viewers that even as a subscriber to our shows, it's not appearing in your homepage. We have been in touch with YouTube about this particular problem, and their advice is for us to ask our audience to turn notifications with the bell icon below this video on. So if you are frustrated that you've subscribed to Novara Media and you love watching your regular Tisky Sours, but they're not coming up on your homepage anymore, click that bell button. I mean, hopefully they'll start appearing in your subscriber page again, but I was never very good at technology, so who knows. We're going to go on to our next story now. Yesterday, the Prime Minister Boris Johnson generated some excitement with a speech promising a new deal to bring Britain out of its coronavirus recession. He even sort of channeled Franklin D. Roosevelt, who was the architect of America's New Deal, which brought their economy out of recession in the 1930s. He's promising some investment. It's not as large as one might have hoped, given the sort of grand title he's given to this project. I know Dalia is going to have loads to say about this because she's a big Green New Deal campaigner. But first, earlier today, I spoke to Hannah Martin. She's co-director of the campaign for a Green New Deal UK. I asked her if she was delighted that after campaigning for a Green New Deal, this idea of a New Deal had now become politically hegemonic.
Delighted is not the word I'd use. You know, this isn't a Green New Deal. It's certainly not anything like the New Deal. It's certainly not anything like what Roosevelt did. Essentially, what was announced yesterday was kind of repackaging and repurposed policies, and there was no new budget announced. And I think, you know, we're in one of the worst economic crises in history, and this is not only not ambitious, it's kind of appalling, really, the lack of ambition. You know, Britain needs something which entirely rebuilds our economy and rebuilds it in a greener and fairer way and builds it back like truly better than it was before. And this New Deal, I mean, it's like a New Deal for the British economy without hardwiring climate in it is like selling somebody a bike without a chain. It's literally not going to get you anywhere. So no, not delighted, I would say.
And what do you make of the government's approach to sort of green economics? Because it seems quite specific. There were reports that Dominic Cummings finds, you know, projects to insulate housing kind of boring. So they've gone for a target to have what they've called Jet Zero, which is to have the first long-haul zero carbon plane. Is this something that you think is simply ridiculous, or is this something that actually the green movement could kind of, you know, use and push towards? If the government is investing in really ambitious green technologies, is that a good thing?
I mean, I think it's certainly interesting that they're using that frame, and it's certainly something for us to work with and to say, you know, what it would actually look like to invest in the green economy, and then give them a suite of like shovel-ready policies. You know, to put it in perspective, a lot of organisations came together to suggest that you needed 25 billion a year for the next 3 years, and that's to meet the 2050 net zero target, which many people consider to be, you know, not nearly good enough and not nearly fast enough and not in line with, our global responsibilities and the historic emissions that we've created globally. So that's 5 times what was promised yesterday, and what was promised yesterday was just repackaged money. It's not new money. So I think to see a serious commitment to a green economy, we'd need to see levels of spending. Possibly the Chancellor next week is going to say something more substantial, but we would really need to see something much more substantial than 5 billion. I think in terms of like the projects, he talked a bit about transport, 4,000 zero carbon buses. It's a useful step. But again, that was already announced in February. And to put it in context, there are 50,000 buses in the UK. So it's like it's not even a half measure. Maybe it's a quarter measure, not really. And then you kind of have to counter it with like 100 million being invested in road building. Well, road building locks us into carbon emissions for decades to come, just when we need to be rolling back from it. It's a bit like what they were trying to do with fracking, locking us into new fossil fuel economies. I think what we would need to see is like a kind of holistic program of investment in the low carbon economy that recognised that it was about insulation, it was about renewable energy, but it was also about things like the care sector. An investment in care in the UK, the Women's Budget Group said yesterday, would produce 2.7 times as many jobs as an equivalent investment in construction. So we need to think about our economy and what is low carbon and what is nourishing in a much more holistic way than what was done yesterday, where it felt like kind of little bits and pieces. I mean, things like the jet zero, it's just a kind of flashy soundbite, really. If he's really serious, aviation is only used by a fraction of the British population. And most of that programme was about offsetting. So it wasn't, it's not real, serious, substantial policies at the level and, with the speed and time that we have to act on this.
That was Hannah Martin, co-director of the Campaign for a Green New Deal UK. Dalia, obviously, calling a recovery program a New Deal sort of raises expectations. I was reading on Twitter that Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal, if it was sort of translated to an economy our size and with currency worth what it's worth now, would be about £800 billion. And Boris Johnson has promised £5 billion of spending. And this is obviously after the biggest short-term crash in the economy in a century. Month on month, actually, this will be a much steeper crash in the Great Depression, because the economy had to stop instantly to stop this pandemic spreading. And the levels of ambition here, £5 billion, it's paltry, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think Hannah really effectively outlined why this is not sufficient in terms of climate change, and that having a sort of New Deal framing that doesn't prioritize the climate because of the scale of emergency that we are in, and the increasingly shortening amount of time that we have to really take decisive action. But the Tories never claimed to kind of care about the climate. So even if you look at it on their own terms, as you mentioned, this completely pales in comparison to the scale of intervention that was represented by Roosevelt's New Deal. Like, the percentage of GDP that was spent by Roosevelt as part of the New Deal was 40%. The percentage of GDP that Boris Johnson's New Deal represents is 0.2%. So it's not comparable, and I think it's deliberate rewriting of history in order that this rebranding is taking place. But also, I think it's really important to recognize that Roosevelt's New Deal was not just about investment. It wasn't just about putting money into things. It was actually a significant sort of political and legislative intervention that tipped the balance of power away from capital and towards labor. So it involved, for example, the massive scaling up of workers' rights. It involved creating trade unions. It involved various bills that basically limited the ability of finance capital to sort of run roughshod over people's money and savings. So things like the Glass-Steagall Act, which was introduced in 1933, that was a recognition that speculative and risky behaviors by bankers using people's savings was what led to the Great Recession. And so repealing it. So Roosevelt put in that Glass-Steagall Act in order to basically separate commercial and investment banking, meaning that bankers could not use people's savings in order to do sort of speculative and risky investments and behaviors. That was later repealed and arguably, again, also led to the 2008 crash. So it's not just about the money, which is kind of completely farcical, really, in terms of how little this investment is into when we're thinking about the scale of the challenge that is presented to us by coronavirus and climate change. But it also doesn't have that political that sort of rewiring of the political landscape that Roosevelt's New Deal did, that really turned it into a moment that significantly improved the lives of many Americans over decades to come. But I also think it's sort of an interesting thing that Boris Johnson tried very hard to distance himself from austerity. You know, he said, we will not respond to this in a way in what has been called austerity. Now, I would still call this a form of austerity because it's essentially not nearly enough to meet the scale of the crisis. You know, unemployment is much higher now as proportionally than it was even in 1929. But it does show, I guess, that those years of campaigning around austerity have kind of paid off, in that the argument around austerity, which, you know, we've discussed on this show and many shows before, no longer sticks, which I think is certainly a good thing.
It's interesting he's gone for New Deal, because I remember, you know, in Labour circles, there was a big debate about should it be Green New Deal or Green Industrial Revolution. And the argument they said go for Green New Deal is because it's, you know, it's what AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, is promoting in the United States. It's got this transnational element. Also, potentially, it's more encompassing than a Green Industrial Revolution. But the argument, and actually I was fairly convinced by it, was it's the Green Industrial Revolution has more traction to a British audience because the New Deal happened in the 1930s in America. I mean, I actually did do it in my GCSE, but unless you did GCSE history from that particular paper, I don't know if you would have come across it. But the Conservatives are now, you know, explicitly drawing from FDR, an American president from the 1930s, and the New Deal, an American party. You know, it seems, I didn't realize, again, it's a bit like whack-a-mole, where it's sort of like, I'm sort of, often when the Conservatives come up with a slogan, I'm like, yeah, I get that. That was genius. You know, the moment you see it, get Brexit done, like, yes, they've got that down. And then sometimes you see it and you have to sort of have a second take. It's like, oh, really? They've gone for New Deal and FDR. I mean,
well, I mean, I actually came on the other side of that, in that I thought that, firstly, like a New Deal was descriptive enough that even if you didn't know about Roosevelt's New Deal, you would still kind of understand what it's talking about. And the reason that I always preferred New Deal was because the New Deal, unlike the Industrial Revolution, was, again, it encompassed that political reorientation, that movement, that tipping of the balance of power away from capital and towards labor. Whereas the Industrial Revolution was the opposite of that. The Industrial Revolution was about sending children to work and using, you know, imperial trade routes and all those kind of ghastly things in order to industrialize, largely off the backs of working class people across the world. So I always preferred New Deal, but I think that it does what it says on the tin enough that people will kind of get what he's trying to do. But I think it's very important that we outline the considerable economic and political distinctions between Johnson's New Deal and what Roosevelt did in the 20th century.
All right, we've got 2 Labour stories to go. And I know with sort of internal Labour stories, some people's ears prick up. You know, they love to hear about the gossip, what's going on inside the Labour Party and inside Momentum. Some people are like, oh, they're talking about the Labour Party again. But I've warned you. And actually, we're going to make it interesting. I love internal drama in the Labour Party. The first thing we're going to talk about is an NEC meeting that happened yesterday. So the NEC is the National Executive Committee of the Labour Party. It's the most important body, I suppose, other than the MPs. They sort of make the rules. And it sounded like there was some drama in the meeting, in fact. So Huda Elmi, who we've had on the show many times before, according to Gebrial from The Times, asked Keir Starmer if he was going to apologise about talking about a Black Lives Matter moment instead of a Black Lives Matter movement. We talked about why that was such a problem on Monday's show. Lara McNeil, who also, again, we have a lot on this show, asked whether he was going to take disciplinary action against Rachel Reeves for sharing a celebratory thread of the Nazi sympathiser Nancy Astor. He said he didn't want to go into that. So in terms of the big political questions, it sounds like, one, there was some drama, and two, Keir Starmer's response left quite a lot to be desired. But the consequential decision that was made in that meeting concerns elections to the NEC. And now this is going to get a bit wonky, so I've got to properly explain it to you. So at the moment, the NEC is made up of about 40 people, and it includes trade union representatives, MPs, the leader, people from the shadow cabinet, some people from socialist societies, and then you've got 9 members who are elected by members online. And at the moment, those 9 members are elected by first past the post. So it's usually the case that whoever puts forward the winning slate, they win all 9 seats. And people say, oh, that's a bit majoritarian. It means that if you get 51% of the members' votes, you get all 9 seats. Now, that argument was used to say, let's make it more pluralistic and have single transferable vote. What this means is that you rank the people you vote for, and you'll probably end up more likely with 5 people from one slate, 4 people from another. Now, on the face of it, that's fine. That's a democratic way of doing things. But the problem is, because only 9 out of the 40 people on the NEC are from members section, it's only really, the left can really only have an influence on the NEC at the moment, given that Keir chooses so many of the people on there, if they win all 9. And what the change means, this change from first past the post to single transferable vote, is that basically the left can win maximum 5 or 6 seats. It gives Keir Starmer almost an inbuilt majority. So that's controversial because it seems like something that's going to empower Keir Starmer against left-wing members. A second controversy was that this decision, changing how people vote in internal elections, was made in an NEC meeting, not at Labour Party conference. To find out exactly what went on yesterday in that NEC meeting, I spoke to Rachel Garnham earlier today. She was one of the left-wing members who was elected to the NEC a couple of years ago. I started by asking whether this was obviously just a power grab from Keir Starmer, or if there was, other arguments that were made.
They didn't put forward any reasoning in the paper we discussed about why they wanted to introduce it. Other than that, they didn't analyse the pros and cons. They didn't consult with any constituencies or the wider membership. And they didn't propose introducing it for any of the other sections, and they weren't willing to take it to annual conference. So I think people can draw their own conclusions from that.
And so some controversy has been the way that this decision was made. So it was decided in an NEC meeting. It's a rule change, basically, that hasn't gone to conference. There is suggestion there might be a legal challenge. I mean, what's your take on that? Do you think this challenge will go ahead? Does it have any chance of winning?
Well, I think members should be challenging the current leadership about their commitments to unity and bringing people together. And this isn't a way of doing things that produces unity or does bring people together. So I'm not generally in favour of resolving things in the courts. I would rather have consultation, discussion, and a decision at annual conference. But it may leave people no choice. We had a long debate, but it wasn't a quality debate about the pros and cons of different systems. And I would rather have that in the wider party rather than see this resolved in the courts. And our rule changes happen at annual conference, and that's where this should be decided.
And so for our viewers who are watching and they're saying, look, Keir Starmer's getting everything he wanted. He's already sacked the most prominent left winger from the shadow cabinet. He's getting rule changes whenever he wants them in the NEC. He's got a general secretary who is to his liking and not to the liking of the Labour left. I mean, what leverage do you think Labour's left wingers still have in the party? It doesn't really seem like there's many opportunities for wins anymore.
I don't think that's true at all. We've still got our rule book and we've still got our annual conference. The annual conference is sovereign. That is clear on this particular issue. Because the electoral system is not specified in the rule book, you can just about get away with a rule change without going to conference. But to actually change what's in the letter of the rule book at the moment, you do have to go to annual conference. The trade unions still make up 50% of the Labour Party. They held the party in check when Blair was in power and put forward progressive policies that meant that Blair was not able to do everything he wanted to. We have not lost every vote at the NEC, despite losing an overall centre-left majority. When we can form alliances to defend the membership, defend party democracy, but we need people to stay in the party and fight. And there's still a lot of democracy at a local level. We were successful in ensuring that branches would be able to shortlist in selections. That wasn't in the original paper. The left put it forward and we won that at the NEC. There are still democratic processes for choosing your parliamentary candidates. As I say, annual conference is our policy making body and our rule making bodies. And we elect our delegates to that through our constituencies and through our trade unions. So there's a lot left to fight for.
So Rachel Garnham there, ending with an argument that not all is lost for the Labour left. I suppose probably at this point in time, we'll see the Labour left actually go back to its more traditional position in the party, which is as underdog, which is as trying to get, some changes made when you've got, the party establishment against you. It's a real, exception that for the last 5 years, the left, well, often being undermined from different parts of the party, but, had some claim to controlling it. That does seem to mainly have gone now. But as Rachel's saying, as we say all the time on the show, you might as well stay in the party anyway, even if you are feeling downhearted about it. If you can afford the direct debit, keep it going. You can vote in internal elections. It doesn't mean you have to, wear a Starmer t-shirt, and you can absolutely 100% put all of your political energy into community organising, doing things outside of the Labour Party. So I've been seeing lots of people make this argument, actually. I think it's a very good one to say that for the last 5 years, being a Labour Party member has been a really significant part of your identity. Maybe most of your activism has gone into that particular area. You might think of yourself more than anything as a Labour Party activist. Over the next 5 years, I imagine many left-wingers, that will change somewhat, right? So you might now use this as an opportunity to start getting organised in renters' unions, tenants' unions, your local trade union, or the trade union in your workplace. But that doesn't mean that you have to leave the Labour Party. You just have a different attitude to it and keep voting in those internal elections, so you can have people like Rachel Garnham in those meetings who are trying to resist any power grab from the centre. And the strategy of the Labour left is going to be, decided in conversations, in CLP meetings around the country. But probably what's going to be more important than anything is what direction Momentum takes. It's one of the institutions which has survived Corbynism. And as our regular viewers will know, they recently had elections to their National Coordinating Group, which is their ruling body. It's Momentum's version of the NEC. And there were two slates which stood for this election: Forward Momentum and Momentum Renewal. If you saw the debate on Novara Media between them, you'll know that Forward Momentum, they really emphasised democracy. They had primaries to decide who would be on their slate. They kind of want to give power back to local groups, make it less centralised, less bureaucratic. And then you had Momentum Renewal. They were standing more on a platform of, look, let's look at what Momentum's done. Let's respect what they've done. Let's focus on winning internal party battles. All this talk of making Momentum into a social movement, a bit far-fetched. It turns out, I thought they were going to get, a bit of half and half. It turns out that Forward Momentum completely swept the board. So they won every single seat that was elected by ordinary Momentum members. Momentum Renewal won the 4 seats that were elected by elected representatives. I think we can get up a graphic now of how these results went down. You can see quite how overwhelming it was, this victory from Forward Momentum. You can see there all of the people from all of the regions are Forward Momentum candidates. You can see Andrew Scattergood, we had him on that debate. And then it's just in the public office holders where some of the Momentum Renewal people won. Now, what I think about this personally is that I think it's positive that Forward Momentum won, in the sense that they run the best campaign. Momentum Renewal is it got a bit personal on Twitter quite a lot. Forward Momentum were quite positive, quite open. And also what it shows is that their primary, which they had to decide whether to get onto the slate, was really galvanizing for them. And I think that's a good example for the Labour left. Maybe we can have a primary to decide who will be our candidates for the NEC, and that will be, again, galvanizing. My only concern, though, and this is a bit personal for me because I was a bit involved in sort of the first instantiation of Momentum, and it was sort of started with many of the same ideas that seemed to sort of be the foundation of Forward Momentum, which is to say, look, if you give local groups autonomy, then they will flourish, and that you can get that energy from these local groups, and you sort of imagine that they'll all be out community organizing, and it will be beautiful, let 1,000 flowers bloom. Now, that was the initial thinking behind Momentum, but it didn't quite work out like that. So whilst you might get one or two very active and great local groups doing brilliant campaigns, often you get 3 men and a dog. Sometimes 2 of those 3 men will be from a sort of small sect, like the Socialist Workers' Party, for example. They're not allowed to join Momentum, so maybe not them, but there are some other ones. And they end up doing things which might be embarrassing for the national organisation or distracting. And what happened before was that many of the people who were working and organising at the national level were firefighting. It ended up being a bit of a party within a party and a bit of a drain of energy instead of something that allowed people to get better organised in the Labour Party. Now, I've been very public about this concern, and earlier today I put this particular concern to Jennifer Forbes, who was elected to the Momentum, my apologies, NCG on the Forward Momentum slate. Let's take a look.
Our campaign started off from listening to the members in the first place and trying to understand where those problems have arisen. So we're coming from a good place of understanding that Momentum hasn't always lived up to those kind of expectations. And we've got good ideas for taking that forward. I personally have a lot of faith in our members. I think that if we give them the support and resources they need, then they can thrive. And in some areas it has thrived. You know, in the metropolitan areas like Bristol and in London, we've got some fantastic groups. Places like where I live in Cornwall, not so much. And I don't think that support has been there to enable that to happen. I think political education, power, democracy to local people to decide the kind of things that they want to campaign on, that fires people up and gets them involved. And I think we can have faith in our members to appreciate that we do need to all move forward together. Positive, progressive campaigning is the order of the day, and we're quite capable of that. But we do need that progressive angle as a strong element to the Labour Party's campaigning right now.
And I suppose one of the main roles that People's Momentum played before the general election was they were sort of a campaigning arm of the Labour Party. Is that something you want to keep up? Will you be getting in touch with Keir Starmer on your first day in the NCG and saying, look, you should keep close relations with us because we've got a great social media game? Or do you think that now Momentum, aren't really represented at the top of the party? They should shift their resources, shift their priorities to being, I suppose, organising within or outside of the party, as opposed to just trying to help Keir Starmer get elected?
I think we're trying to help the Labour Party achieve great things when we get into government. We want to make sure we've got a fantastic green agenda going forward that really inspires people. We need to be inspiring people to get out on the streets and campaign like they have done in the past. And I think that's a role that Momentum has played well. The mobilisation part of Momentum has been fantastic last time around. It did really work, and we need to continue that. But the campaigning element is essential. Having solid ideas for how we move out of the COVID crisis. And coming up this summer, there might be a lot of people struggling with rent evictions. We need the Labour Party to be supporting people through this crisis in a solid way, and Momentum can offer some really solid campaign expertise, like reaching out through the tenants' organisations. A lot of people are going to be facing redundancies. We've got plans to work better with the trade unions and make sure we're joining all up the Labour movement as much as we possibly can and be a solid campaigning force from the left.
So that was Jennifer Forbes, recently elected to the National Coordinating Group of Momentum. Obviously, congratulations to everyone who won that election. I think it was a pretty decent campaign. Some good candidates on all sides. Dalia, I know the nitty-gritty of internal Labour Party beef is not necessarily the topic you love above all else, but I do think this question of should Momentum try and be a social movement is a good one, because sometimes, I'm often critical of this idea of, a movement of movement, organisations which try and do too much. And so when people say Momentum needs to be organising in every workplace, in every community, blah, 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 I kind of feel like, really, is that going to, maybe we need to pare back our ambitions and have different organizations do different things. But I don't know, where do you stand on this question?
Well, I think that before we do anything, there needs to be a really serious review of what went wrong. And I think that, especially, you know, as the kind of Black Lives Matter movement in this country was really firing up, I just was thinking to myself, you know, it's so interesting to me that one of the major issues that Corbynism and Momentum conceded on, you know, the issue of policing, we were told, you know, that it was a vote loser, that it wasn't going to mobilize people. And there was so much so much messaging around this idea that, you know, we should talk about austerity in terms of policing. And then not that long after, you know, not 6 months after, one of the biggest multiracial working class movements that we've seen, that was not just happening in these big metropolitan areas, but were happening in towns and much smaller sort of non-urban areas, erupted over the issue of policing. And I'm just thinking, okay, so there is a massive disjuncture there between people who are calling themselves grassroots and etc. with actually what is happening on the ground. And I think that, you know, going forward, it's important to be very specific and very sort of ensure that what you are claiming to do is something that you, as the people who are involved in running this organization, are actually capable of doing. And I think that there was an issue that there was sort of the lip service being paid to kind of grassroots organizing, when actually it's quite clear that that connection was really not being made. And that doesn't mean that there aren't other things that can be done, but I think it's important to be honest and frank with ourselves about what can actually be achieved going forward.
I mean, it's something that we've talked about on the show a lot. It's this idea: do we need Starmer to back Black Lives Matter? Do we need there to be a close relationship between Black Lives Matter and the Labour Party, or do we accept that they're doing such fundamentally different things that basically they should be independent? You know, Black Lives Matter should be changing public opinion and pressuring the Labour Party, and the Labour Party should be independent over here, not claiming to be, you know, representing a dynamic movement for Black people's rights, but sort of absorbing policies when it's forced to, or when it feels like that's the wise thing to do. I mean, in a way, there was also, you know, people over the last 5 years got very excited about this idea of the movement party. And I did it in a way as well. It's this idea that you can sort of bring together electoral politics and movement politics to become more than the sum of its parts. And it's possible that it actually becomes less than the sum of its parts, because the sort of electoral realities imposed on social movements makes them a bit more conservative, and the relationship to social movements for the political party makes it, you know, harder to get elected, because you've got two quite incompatible motivations which are being combined into one particular project, which can often be more messy than useful.
Well, I mean, I think that it's certainly possible. And I think that it requires, but you have to kind of decide what you want to do. Are you going to be a party that draws its power from movements, from organizing? Or are you going to be a party that draws its power from trying to get the right headlines and being friends with the right journalists? And I think that the problem that Corbyn had was that he and his team sort of tried to sort of do both and ended up sort of not doing either. But in terms of, you know, should we need the Labour Party to be pro Black Lives Matter? Well, let me just say this, like, you have to earn the right to say Black Lives Matter. You have to earn the right with your actions and with political will, particularly if you are in a position of power, such as an MP or the head of a party. So I think that really it is a privilege to be able to position yourself into that movement, and you have to earn the right. And if your actions and your policies and your programs and your ideology is not consistent with the idea that Black Lives Matter, then you don't get to say it. And we have to basically relate on those terms. But I certainly don't think that the Black Lives Matter movement necessarily needs party support. I think it's building power in other ways, but I would much prefer if, you know, we had parties that did actually represent the principles of Black Lives Matter, but they don't. So I don't think that that's really the juncture that we're at right now.
I think that's a brilliant note to end the show on. Those are issues we will continue debating on Tysky Sour over the coming weeks, months, and yes, probably years. Thank you so much, Dalia, for joining me as ever on a Wednesday evening. It's been a pleasure having you on, and thank you for watching Tysky Sour. Thank you for all your comments, your tweets. If you do want to help us build Novara Media to grow, to get bigger. Please go to novaramedia.com/support and donate the equivalent of 1 hour's wage a month. Finally, because I haven't said it yet this evening, if you've been watching up to this point, press like. It helps in the algorithm. We'll be back on Friday night. You've been watching Tysky Sour on Novara Media. Good night.